So you've put together a mesh and you've worked through a lot of different things that you've been learning, and you start to realize that there's some problems. It doesn't look right. What's going on? Or for that matter, you start realizing that there's holes in the mesh. What to do? Well, fear not, at least not too much. There are some tools that can help to deal with situations like this. Now, first of all, ideally, you don't get into this situation. It's better to do it right and be thorough and not play fast and loose. Secondly, if you do find yourself in a situation like this, number one, hopefully you've saved different versions of the project so that you can simply revert back a few steps and hopefully save yourself some time and difficulty. Secondly, if that's not the case, honestly and truly, in many, many, many cases, it's not that bad to start over again. In this series of videos where we're just kind of throwing together geometric forms to create a character, none of the things that have gone into this have taken any length of time in and of themselves. And it really would not take long to reconstruct something like this. If, however, you're in a situation where you don't want to or you cannot start over and you want to try to clean something like this up, let's consider the 3D Print Toolbox. So if we go to Edit and go to our Preferences, just do a search for 3D Print Toolbox and check that box. You now have access to a suite of tools that will be right here. If you don't see them, simply push N on your number pad, and it should be one of the tabs on the sidebar. With this, we can look at and consider a large number of problems that might crop up. I'm not planning on fixing this entire thing in this particular session. I will do that separately, but let's just talk about some of these items. First of all, if we go to Check All, after selecting Check All, it will take a few minutes to run through things, and it's going to look for problems. And these are the problems that it's found. Now, we're going to discuss a few of these. First of all, overhanging faces. Sometimes that's an issue, sometimes that's not. If you're planning on 3D printing, overhanging faces is definitely something that's worth looking at. At the moment, we're going to skip that. Now, looking at some of these other ones in the top, non-manifold edges. If we select any one of these items, it will highlight them. And non-manifold edges, it's showing some right here. So knowing that there's a group right over here, I'm going to zoom in on this area by selecting it and pushing the period on my keypad. And then I'll reselect non-manifold edges. Now, this is something I did intentionally. But we can see right here that there's a gap, that there is a hole in the mesh. And that's what manifold means. Something that is non-manifold is basically watertight. So if you're trying to do surgery on something like this and fix it, we can select vertices, hold down the Shift button. So if you decide that you want to try to fix this manually, you can select specific vertices and then push F to fill in that gap. Or you can select edges. And again, select F to fill in that gap. If I hold down Control, it will bridge the gap as best as it can, grabbing everything that's possible. And I'll go ahead and select that as well and push F. Now, my suspicion is this particular face that I created might not be quite right because it looks to me as if these vertices might not be at the same height as this vertex. And that means that this face is probably bending in space. But that's something we'll come back to in a few moments. And even looking at this area, it looks to me like there's some difficulty here. If I try to fix this up, it's doable though. But it does take a little bit of time and effort if you're trying to do something like this. After recalculating, we can see that the non-manifold edges did improve based on the couple of changes that we made in this area. I'm going to zoom back out and I'm going to select the bad contiguous edges. And we can see that something crazy is going on here. Now, sometimes these things can be dealt with fairly easily. Now, looking at the bad contiguous edges, I'm going to select all by pressing A. I'm going to go up to my mesh. I'm going to select normals and I'm going to recalculate the outside. After doing that, I'm going to do a quick check all and we'll see if anything changed in these numbers. They did, however, they appear to have actually gotten worse. So let's try this again. This time I'm going to go to the mesh and I'm going to go to the normals and I'm going to recalculate the inside. We'll see if that gives us a different result. Okay, now that did actually improve, although not as much as I had hoped. But that is one thing that you can do to try to improve that. But if nothing else, just being able to look at and find where those problems are and being able to examine the issue is of some value. Now, intersecting faces, let's take a quick look at that. Now we can see all sorts of problems. Like I pointed out, there are holes in this mesh from when my having joined the forms was perhaps a little sloppy, as if maybe I was planning on trying to do some troubleshooting later on. But either way, what we have is we have a situation where we do have some faces that sort of overlap or are doing some crazy things. So there are different ways of dealing with this. We can look at a face like this, which quite honestly is a complete mess. There's no reason for that face to even exist. And we can also see the impossibility of this face. So I'm going to select this face, and I'm going to go up to the Faces menu. And there's an intersect knife and an intersect boolean. I'm going to try the intersect knife tool, and I get some options here. And you can see things appear to have changed already. So first of all, if I check self-intersect, we can see that the geometry has changed. I'm going to actually go with that for the moment, because it appears to have tried to recalculate what's going on here. Let's look at some other intersecting faces as well. Right here we can see there's a number of problems. Part of me wonders if I don't just grab a few of these vertices and merge them at center and see what happens now. If I do a check all, does that improve the situation? And it did. We specifically got rid of a few intersecting faces. Now, again, I believe I've opened up another problem by fixing that one, but we'll deal with that in a few moments as well. The point is that sometimes by simply looking at these items, you can see the problem and sometimes figure out what to do about it. Zero faces are basically faces that are, in theory, too small, and sometimes they will have an impact on 3D printing. Now, sometimes I will ignore them depending on what they are. Sometimes you'll want to deal with them. And if you're 3D printing, you might need to be very sensitive to these things. But let's go ahead and take a look at this, for example. If I zoom in on this area and select these zero faces, maybe we can make a few small changes. If I merge these two vertices at the center, do a quick check, well, that did get rid of one of those faces, and that area seems to have been improved. So it's just that one extra little vertex that was out over here that was part of this face that was creating a problem. Non-flat faces are definitely a problem. And that is, we can look right at this face that I was just examining, and basically what we have is sort of impossible geometry. This is a face. A face is supposed to be flat, and we can see that this is curving around. If you want to deal with that, one thing might be to go up to Mesh, and you can go to your cleanup tools. And there's an option to split non-planar faces. So now it's changed the geometry and added appropriate faces to fix that problem. So now if we do a check all, we'll see what happens with our non-flat faces. Well, it did fix those. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to try that with all of them selected. So I'm going to go to my mesh, clean up, split non-planar faces. And let's do another check. And hopefully we'll see that most of these are gone. Well, certainly a lot. Now under this, I would just, again, go to the cleanup and point out that there's a number of things. There's a delete loose in case you happen to have some stray vertices that got disconnected from the mesh. There is the filling holes. There's merging by distance. So for example, if we select everything, and maybe there are some thin faces or some geometry that have some very close vertices. I've got my vertex count here. We can go to our mesh. We can go to cleanup. We can say merge by distance. Maybe I'll take that number up just a little bit, and we will see that my vertex count did in fact go down. Also under cleanup tool, in addition to the splitting planar faces, we can split concave faces. Okay, now one thing I'm going to do on top of this is there's also under the mesh under cleanup, you can try to fill holes. Now, the thing is, it's not going to fill all holes. There's limitations. It doesn't always understand the situation. So when it's filling holes, it's looking for smaller gaps that need to be filled. And sometimes when it sees something like this, particularly when there's confusing geometry inside of it that appears to be part of the mesh as well, it won't know to fill those in. So that fill holes is not a magic bullet that will fix everything. If it does, though, the final step you can do is go ahead and you can take this and you can make this mesh manifold. Now, in my case, it's going to backfire. And I lied. I was apparently wrong. So I was expecting the failure on making this manifold. It apparently did make a manifold, even though I have gaps and problems that are very obvious and holes in the mesh. But that at least gives you a brief and somewhat insufficient overview of what you can do if you want to try to fix a mesh that is having some of these problems. For my part, I'm going to actually take a step back and continue working from a version that was remeshed more appropriately.